Good evening, and welcome to what will be a great night. My name is Ian Rowe. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior visiting fellow at 1776 Unites. And tonight, we have a very intriguing conversation amongst two of my colleagues, who I'll introduce shortly, who are also work with me at 1776 Unites, to introduce a whole new contemporary scholars series, insights into unbelievably effective leaders, economists within the Black community that don't get the recognition that they're due. And we think 1776 Unites can be a great platform to introduce more people to the work of Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, Glenn Loury, because those are the first three individuals that we're going to be featuring. And tonight, we're going to be featuring the great work of Walter Williams. And along the folks that are going to work with me tonight are Dr. Anthony Bradley, who's the professor of religious studies and director of the Center for the Study of Human Flourishing at the King's College. Hello, Dr. Bradley. All right. And we're also joined by Delano Squires, who's a contributor at Blaze Media and also a contributor to the Woodson Center 1776 Unites. Hello, Delano.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, Dr. Bradley.
All right, great to see you both. Well, for those of you who do not know, 1776 Unites came together last year under the leadership of Bob Woodson, who for the last 40 years has led the Woodson Center, always focused on how to empower communities to become agents of their own uplift. And in the aftermath of the New York Times 1619 Project, which painted the United States as this permanently racist country, rather than just shout in the rain and criticize, I mean, there were enough historians discrediting that project, a collection of primarily Black leaders came together and said, can we create a more empowering argument about the founding principles and how the embrace of those has actually been the mechanism by which the Black community has moved from persecution to prosperity. And so a group of us came together and we wrote essays and we did speeches and I think have added a great contribution. We also did something very important, was that we created an actual curriculum it's still in its early stages, about a year ago, September, to tell a more complete story of the African-American experience in the United States. Stories, units on things like the Rosenwald schools, inventors like Elijah McCoy, Biddy Mason, an American woman who was born a slave and died a millionaire. That curriculum has now been downloaded more than 20,000 times by teachers in all 50 states, in every type of school: private school, charter school, traditional district school, after school, homeschool, prison ministries, wherever character formation is happening with children. And we're really inspired by that. But tonight we're announcing a new component of the 1776 Unites curriculum, and it's to honor contemporary scholars. So the 1776 Unites curriculum is certainly about a look past at the African-American experience in the United States, but also a look forward and a look even present day at scholars that you may have not heard of. You know, today I will share, some of you may not know, but the MacArthur Genius Grants were announced today, and it just turns out that Ibram X. Kendi won one of those grants today. And so it might be that people think, oh, well, it's folks like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram Kendi, Nicole Hannah-Jones. Those are the people that speak for the Black community. Well, there are some alternative viewpoints. And tonight we're actually focusing on the work of Dr. Walter Williams as just one of the contemporary scholars that we will be featuring in the 1776 Unites curriculum. He's the first, that unit has now been issued. If you go to 1776unites.com and just look at curriculum, you'll see this first unit. We'll also have future units on Dr. Thomas Sowell, Dr. Glenn Loury. We're taking invitations for other contemporary scholars that have done incredible work within the Black community that many people aren't aware of. And before I give a brief bio, I'd love to bring in Dr. Bradley and Delano Squires just to talk a little bit about Dr. Williams, how his work has influenced even your own thoughts on how you viewed opportunity for the Black community and just opportunity more broadly. So Dr. Bradley, we would love your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. I think Walter Williams is really important if you sort of think about his age and experience. On the one hand, he born in 1936, saw Jim Crow, saw the Black community living under worse conditions than we are right now, but also saw them thrive. Also saw that transition happen in the 60s and 70s. And on the flip side of the 80s and 90s, he saw some of those really negative externalities that were experienced in a lot of urban areas. So he sort of saw the range over his lifetime. And that's a generation I think we're losing. We're losing that sort of Jim Crow generation. Mm-hmm. And that perspective of having lived through that is really important. I think one of the great contributions I find of his work that had a massive influence on me is he just rejected the idea of the Black experience being defined by environmental narratives, namely that the Black experience, Black decision making, the ways in which sort of Black life progressed was because of the environment around them, and that if you just change the environment through government policy, that you would see Black thriving. He rejected that outright, that it was just somehow this sort of fish tank view that really undermined or rather determined Black progress. So he was really concerned about those sorts of things that undermined Black agency, the things that's kind of got in the way of Black folks thriving. He was really adamant about the idea that poverty does not cause a crime. Poverty itself is not something that creates negative externalities, what we used to call pathologies in low-income communities, because Black folk were poor during Jim Crow, and you didn't see some of the sorts of things that we see in a lot of low-income communities today. He also made a great contribution in the sense that he interrogated race, not in terms of ideology, but in terms of economics. And I think as an economist, his non-ideological, rather data-driven emphasis was incredibly important, because it forced us to look at all of the variables that tend to impact the Black community. Not simply income disparities that we might think about, but look at everything, right? The role of marriage and family and values and all those sorts of things that come to play, the role of government policy and how those things might undermine Black thriving as well. I think finally for me, Walter Williams was really an advocate of less government, right? More freedom, more economic liberty, more political liberty. And it's simply this idea that if you just got government, surrogate decision makers out of the way of the kind of natural creativity and entrepreneurial spirit that you see in Black communities would not only thrive, but would be sustainable. But what happened, as he also notes in much of this work, for a lot of low-income and a lot of low-income Black communities, government policy actually undermined Black agency and Black freedom and Black political liberty. And so I think his great contribution, which is often lost today, one, is being data-driven, not simply soundbite and ideological-driven. So bring some data to the table. And secondly, looking at the ways in which the expansion of government, the expansion of the welfare state actually has made many communities worse rather than better.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bradley. I mean, that data-driven approach is so important, because what he was able to do, he went after some sacred cows, right, within the Black community, the things that you're just supposed to be for, right? Minimum wage, affirmative action, reparations, like you're just supposed to be for those things. And yet he had an intellectual analysis which actually said those things are working across purposes. Delano, I'm curious how you received as a rising scholar yourself, have you received this information from Walter Williams and how he's helped to shape your own thinking?
Thank you, Ian, for that. And I just want to piggyback on what you said and what Dr. Bradley said. I came to Dr. Williams a little bit later in life, so I wasn't as familiar with some of his work as other people maybe. But just from what I've taken in from his life's work, his life story, I mean, you see his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, which I often refer to as just fashionable folly, and his desire to put data over dogma. And I think that's what Dr. Bradley said just now. So a couple of things I draw from that. One, it's incredibly frustrating to see that we're still having some of the same conversations about the proper role of government, decades after, the height of his career. I mean, I saw some of the things he was doing in the 1980s, and he was talking about when government grows big, the individual grows small. And in many respects, we're still having those conversations right now. But in terms of my own thinking, he's really shaped me, particularly someone with a background in public policy, because I look at the intersection of policy and culture. And as an economist, what I draw from him are what I would call the four I's, right? There's intent, incentives, interests, and impact. And I don't think it's any surprise or any coincidence that the first three scholars up in this series are all economists. Because one thing that economists do and have to do that politicians and people from other disciplines don't necessarily have to do is look at the direction in which the interests and the incentives are flowing. And when you allow people, rational human beings, adults, to make their own decisions, more often than not, they are going to make decisions that work in their own interests. And I think what Dr. Williams was trying to point out even back then is that when you allow that decision making to rest in the hands of bureaucrats, bureaucrats are going to make decisions that work in their interests. Mm. And to the extent that their interests align with your interests, you'll be fine. But when their interests are at cross purposes with yours, right? Yep. And I know he talked a lot about, Dr. Bradley and Ian, you mentioned minimum wage. He talked a lot about occupational licenses and things, barriers that government put up that disproportionately impacted, African-American and low-income communities. Another one was the school choice. So, when parents have the opportunity to make decisions that work best for their children, they make decisions that they think are in their children's interests. But when bureaucrats are forced to choose between your child's education and the interests of the teachers' unions that support them, exactly what they're going to choose, every day of the week. So Walter Williams has had a tremendous impact on me, as I think about these issues, as I think about those four I's and how they impact both public policy, popular culture, and ultimately, human behavior.
Yeah. I mean, you just said it. When government grows big, the individual grows small. And I just wonder, Dr. Bradley, why do you think it's so alluring? Because it does seem obvious that the big bureaucracies, we're currently, in Congress right now, we're talking about a $3.5 trillion proposal on top of trillions of other dollars of spending. And yet there's not a lot of focus on what does the individual has the capacity to achieve. Why is it so difficult, do you think, for ideas or economists like a Walter Williams, his ideas to emerge? Because you would think most individuals, most Americans would actually gravitate to ideas that gave them more individual freedom.
That's a great question. I think it's largely in part, and Walter Williams mentions this in his book Race and Economics. There's a subsection, I think, in the first or second chapter where he makes this distinction between intentions versus effects. And essentially what happens is the sentimentalism and the intentions are the basis from which we make policy. And we don't think beyond stage 1, 2, 3 down the road about whether or not it's going to work, and B, if it's actually going to produce the outcomes that the policy itself is structured to produce.
Well, but these folks just want the press release. They want the benefit of the press release.
And so as long as intentions are what matter, right? As long as the sort of rhetorical flair of emotion is what's sort of driving how we do policy, and not asking the question, is it actually good for people? Does it work? Is it going to change the way that decisions are made with individuals? And think beyond the sort of first stage, right? Sort of think, well, if we pass this policy, then what? And then what? And then what? And this is why economists are so helpful, because they introduce this really controlling variable that forces us to think beyond that first stage. And so people don't want to do that, right? We like the emotion, we like intentions, and we actually, I think most Americans are fairly lazy thinkers, and we don't want to do the hard work to consider the sort of long-term, the longitudinal potential effects and outcomes. And what's so terrible about what we've seen, and I could completely understand why Walter Williams was so frustrated near the end of his career, is that he saw the good intentions become a disaster. And the evidence about the disaster is loud and clear as day, but we still are making the same policies. And he's thinking, why are we neurotically insane when the evidence and the data says this doesn't work? And I think it's that drive given intentionality and emotion, and not thinking about the effects that continues to sabotage us today.
Yeah. So Delano, I mean, it is so clear that whatever the good intentions are, the actual consequences of many of these policies just haven't worked for the Black community. And yet folks like Ibram Kendi are winning MacArthur Genius Awards, right? Do you think Walter Williams would be in the running for a MacArthur Genius Award right now? And by the way, we must say that Dr. Williams died in December of last year, so he is no longer with us, but we certainly want his ideas to persist. But what's your thought about his ideas and this difficulty of having them embraced more widely?
I think a big part of it is just, people like Ibram Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones. Part of the reason they're rewarded is because they affirm the worldview of the people who are giving those awards. And given the demographics of those individuals, right, largely white, oftentimes center-left politically, their work continues what I describe is the how do I say it? It's not a parasitic relationship. It's a syncretic relationship between white liberals who are looking for absolution for sins that they didn't commit, and Black liberals who are looking to be affirmed for injustices that they didn't suffer.
Oof.
So when Ibram Kendi speaks and he says all of the problems that we see in Black America are caused by racist policy, that allows some of these awardees to say, "Oh, thank you. I thought it was me. Oh, thank you. Now there's someone else, to blame." So Walter Williams didn't do that, right? He was not concerned with the feelings of white liberals when it came to assessing public policy. He was concerned with, to Dr. Bradley's point, what impact that policy would have on the people it was meant for. And one of the big things, and again, just given my own background, that I always think about with public policy is what are some of the consequences are clear, right? Well, what are some of the unintended consequences, right? Because sometimes we incentivize behavior that we don't realize, and he would talk often about, slovenly behavior, and in his criticisms of the welfare state, he would note, and I note this as a father, right? He says, what you reward, or in this case, what you subsidize, you get more of.
Mm-hmm.
What you tax or penalize, you get less of. So when the government rewards the unhitching of marriage and child rearing, you should expect to get more of that. And he noted that this is not even a race question. I think he talked about the welfare state. I want to say it was in Sweden, one of the Nordic countries, where at the time he was speaking, it was over half of all children were born to unwed parents. So it's the same type of incentives. But I want to say one thing really quick, and you asked this question, Ian, about that role of government and why some of his ideas didn't get the traction that they should have. I think part of it is we've become accustomed to this type of to the relationship that I would describe as paternalistic between the government and its citizens. And anyone who exercises knows that if you don't work a muscle and you let it, lie dormant for long enough, it will atrophy. And in addition to being an economist, Dr. Williams was also a political philosopher. And we don't have many of those now. And particularly in the Black community, the extent of the political philosophy that we get is, this is the best way to secure resources. We don't really talk about the proper relationship between government and the citizenry. It's just, what is the best way to align ourselves to reap as many of the spoils of government as we possibly can. And many of our leaders, whether they be activists or elected officials or athletes, or even academics, don't really ask some of those first order questions. What is a government for? Whose interests does it serve? And I think that's one of the things that Walter Williams had that made him stand head and shoulders, above some of his contemporaries.
This is excellent commentary, and we're already starting to get questions. If you have questions, please email tim.sprunt@aei.org. That's tim.s as in Sam, PRUNT @aei.org, or on Twitter, #1776unites. Please send in your questions. Just as we've been talking about, one of Dr. Walter Williams' famous catchphrases was this: the welfare state has done to Black Americans what slavery could not do, and that is to destroy the Black family. I remember when he first said that, there was a lot of pushback. And they're saying, no, it was. What kind of evidence do you think backs up that kind of statement that shows, we just have to be honest that there's certainly a correlation between the growth of government and the welfare state and the dramatic rise, particularly in non-marital birth rates within the Black community? Either one of you can jump on that first.
Yeah, I can. I'm happy to get this line of questioning started here. I think one problem with this, I think he got pushback initially because there's a lot of ignorance about what happened during the several hundred years of slavery. Was it true that some families were disintegrated and divided? That did happen in some cases, but largely, for the most part, families remained intact. And across multiple generations, you'd have on one plantation. My family comes from the Bradley plantation, for example, in Escambia County, Alabama. And so there is this narrative that sort of what was standardized in slavery was the disintegration and the division of families. That wasn't necessarily always the case. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's part of the problem. But also if you look at the data, right, between 1971 and 1974, the welfare rolls increased 125%. And one of the things that happened is that it incentivized keeping fathers away from their children And it also incentivized fathers not being in the home with the women who were the mothers of their children, rather married or not married. And when you look at that particular data point in the early 1970s, you can begin to see the unraveling, particularly in lower income Black communities. You begin to see at that point the unraveling of the family. Pre-Jim Crow, during Jim Crow, you had poor Black communities for which the celebration of marriage and romance and family was aspirational. And after the expansion of the welfare state in the early 1970s, what became aspirational was getting a check and having sex, not romance, not marriage, not establishing a home. Those things were no longer inspirational. And as soon as marriage and family and building a home no longer became inspirational for men, the rest is history.
It is interesting, Delano. And we do have to say that the phenomena that occurred within the Black community is now across race. It's what I call the equal opportunity tsunami in terms of the decline of family structure. So what would you say? Because I'm sure Walter Williams would have an interesting response to this, which is, it's like, okay, well, this phenomenon is happening. Shouldn't government just bend towards this phenomena of more children not being raised in family structures? Like, what do you think he would say to that? Because that is much of the narrative that is being put forth.
I mean, at this point, it seems as if that's the direction in which we're going, because many of our elected officials, particularly in the Democratic Party, and particularly Black Democrats, show little desire to talk about marriage and promote marriage as it relates to the flourishing of the American population, particularly in the Black community. So they will give lip service to families. But when I went and I read both party platforms in 2020, and I did a word search on marriage and family. I want to say the only time that family came up in the Democratic platform is when they talked about family leave policy. Wow. But on the Republican side, they have an entire section that says the family is the cornerstone of a civil society, and they specified the natural family, the nuclear family. So married biological parents raising their own children. I don't think that the Democratic Party wants anything to do with that conversation. So in many respects, we are already at a point where it's, regardless of where people start, regardless of what personal decisions they make, our government should do what it must to ensure everyone has the same outcomes. And that's just not something that jives with reality. So I think, in many respects, the work of Walter Williams and Dr. Bradley talked about this as it relates to marriage and the family, right? Black folks have always desired family, and slavery could not break that bond. If anything, we see, a key aspect of human nature, which is the hotter the fire of sort of external oppression, the more it refines the gold and the stronger it becomes. But what really can take a community down, anybody. So whether it's your favorite, music group, your favorite sports team, or, a religious institution, it's always the disintegration that starts on the inside. When you do a home inspection, they check for termites, not birds that fly into the house. So it's always what starts on the inside. And I think, and one of the things 2 points I want to press really quickly. One is what Dr. Bradley brought up in terms of the expansion of the welfare rolls. I think it's important that people know that part of that expansion was intentional. So when you read about the Cloward-Piven strategy and their desire to actively recruit Black women to get onto the welfare rolls, with the intention of bankrupting the system, particularly in New York City, so that the federal government would have to step in and then, provide what would amount to some sort of, universal basic income. You can see, just how, oftentimes leaving these decisions in the hands of bureaucrats exposes citizens to adverse, effects. And oftentimes the issue is not malice, it's hubris. It's the notion that, someone sitting in some faraway government office or ivory tower knows what's best for 330 million people. And if they would just, submit to that person's plans and ideas for life and family and society, that everything would work out okay. The second point I wanted to say really quick, and this comes up oftentimes, particularly on the right, the political right, which is, why do we have to talk so much about race, right? And Ian, to your point, some of these issues you see across race. So where the Black out of wedlock birth rate was in 1965, the white one is
higher than that.
Right, it's high. I think it's maybe about 35%. But again, those numbers look very different if you're looking at non-college educated whites.
Absolutely.
But one of the reasons why race is important, right, is because no other group starts their conversations about why their families are falling apart with slavery. So they may say economics, they may say culture, and all of those things matter. But in the Black community, there's a lot of programming that we have to overcome to even get to the point of being able to discuss some of these issues. So in many respects, I see, the legacy of Dr. Williams for people like myself and Dr. Bradley and other, particularly Black scholars who care about this work, is to be, in some respects, what I call HSL instructors. Humanity is a second language. We speak race because that's what you speak right now, but we really want to show you that these problems are common to all of mankind, and really talk about solutions that would benefit everyone equally.
Yeah. Wow, very powerful. I mean, Dr. Williams, he did acknowledge, there was a legacy of slavery. We just got a question, what about people who say that Jim Crow laws, those were the things that prevented Black families from saving money. So therefore, society now owes them for housing, redlining. There's a litany of things that people say, yeah, it happened years ago, but the legacy, it's still very, very vibrant. When do we pivot to taking responsibility for those things, or is that just a never-ending well that some leaders within the Black community are just going to keep tapping into?
So it's really interesting, because over the last couple of years, I've thought more and more about some of these questions, right? I don't think any honest person, Black or white, would deny the fact that codifying, both through law and policy as well as cultural norms and social institutions, codifying second-class citizenship obviously will have an effect on people. You may not always be able to predict that effect for each individual, but it will have an effect. I don't think anyone denies that. My question to the people who posed this question about redlining is, okay, because we know where this goes, right? We know the final destination, which is reparations, cash reparations for slavery and or Jim Crow. My question would be, at what cost? Would you be willing, if the government says we'll sign the check, would you be willing to then, give up your claims of United States is systemically and endemically racist? Would you be willing to close up shop on all the race centers? Would you be willing to, withdraw Ibram Kendi's MacArthur Genius Award? Because, again, policies have consequences. And I would really be interested. I wish, Dr. Williams was live now. And I know Glenn Loury has talked about this issue. I would really love to hear his position on this, because I think this may become, at some point in the future, the grand bargain, where conservatives in many respects pay ransom money to be declared whole and clean again. And I would really like to see if it actually came to it, whether the progressives or the people on the left, if they actually were able to catch the car that they've been chasing all these years, would they actually want to?
Right.
Or is it worth more to them to continue to keep that tab open and say, no, the debt that you owe us is going up? Because, Ian, to your point, eventually we're going to have to say, regardless of where we came from, we are here right now. And the path forward for Black Americans is the same as it is for everyone else. Education and mastery, not mediocrity, not lowering standards in the name of equity. Strong families, strong faith, work whatever job you can get until you can get a better job, and enforce and incentivize positive, affirming cultural practices. And that's how most populations get rise in this society.
Yeah. I mean, Dr. Bradley, Dr. Williams rejected this idea that there could ever be any amount of money that could pay back the debt that is owed. And yet again, that idea continues to carry momentum and favor in contemporary society. How do we, now taking this broader, how do we, as people who have opposing views, what's the compelling argument you think we can start making to rebut this idea that it's an artificial cash payment? That's all that's needed to resurrect the interests of the Black community.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it has a lot to do with what the Woodson Center's 1776 Unites project is doing. It's infusing the rest of the narrative. Here's what I mean. I think what's happened is that in our imaginations we went from slavery to 2021. And we have got to tell the history of the Gilded Age during Reconstruction, where you had Black banks, you had Black institutions. Even during Jim Crow, you had Black insurance agencies, right? You had Black banks, you had Black Wall Street in Tulsa, right? You had all of these institutions that were existing. Capital was being amassed. It was being distributed based on people's creativity, entrepreneurship. Those sorts of things were happening. The question is, what killed that?
And what killed that in certain segments of the Black community, right?
Absolutely, because the Black middle class, if we wanted to tap into W.B. Du Bois, right? The Black middle class did great. But that entrepreneurial spirit and opportunity in that lower quintile, sort of Black lower working class, that it just disintegrated and died. And so, if we were to talk about sort of reparations today, we can have that conversation, but it needs to be historically informed with data, right? What do we actually need to be addressing? We never had this robust conversation about the transition from Jim Crow to full integration. That never happened. And we need to have that discussion that's informed by the data of what Black life was actually like in the communities during Jim Crow, recognizing that so much of this was regional. Black folk in Atlanta, in many parts of Atlanta, did great. That's why W.B. Du Bois had a whole category called, Atlanta Black folk, right? There were Philly Black folk, and D.C. Black folk, and Chicago Black folk, and Tulsa Black folk. In rural communities, you had much more economic stagnation, but in some of these larger southern cities, you had much more opportunity. I want us to have a discussion that's informed by what I would consider that missing window, Reconstruction during Jim Crow, so we can talk about what got in the way. And I think this is what Dr. Williams will talk about. What is it that stopped the already progress that was happening? What got in the way of all these Black banks and insurance agencies and all of these institutions, schools, right? You have Black PhDs teaching at Dunbar High School in DC. Like what stopped that? And what can we do to be producing more of that organic, localized, a free thinking entrepreneurial activity that we know is already in our own communities, but the tap is dry, right? The spigot's been shut off, and we need to open it and release it. And that's why Dr. Williams talked much more about more liberty, right? More economic liberty, more opportunity, and letting government get out of the way. That also needs to be a part of the discussion about what we need to repair. Maybe what we need to repair in terms of reparations, maybe we need to repair this ideology that government bureaucrats and politicians sitting in offices in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away from Black individuals, magically have the genius to know what's best for people. Maybe we need to repair that thinking, right? Maybe we need to repair the idea that introducing all sorts of bureaucratic barriers to entry in low-income communities are preventing Black businesses from starting. Maybe we need to repair some of those things to unlock the economic, the intellectual potential that I believe is just sitting there, dormant, stagnant, sabotaged by forces that were foreign to those communities several decades ago.
Well, it's just great discussion. I mean, several Black leaders, in search of answer to your question of what stopped Black progress, they seem to be determined to keep white people on the hook. Right? We got to perpetuate the sense of white guilt. And Dr. Williams had actually a very different approach. It's a little humorous, but he actually had the idea of a pardon for white people. It's worth reading this if our viewers aren't familiar with it. But Dr. Williams wrote, whereas Europeans kept my forebears in bondage some 3 centuries toiling without pay, Americans of European ancestry are guilty of great crimes against my ancestors and their progeny. But in the recognition, Europeans themselves have been victims of various and sundry human rights violations. To wit, so he's actually acknowledging the suffering that Europeans suffer. So this is what he said: I, Walter E. Williams, do declare full and general amnesty and pardon to all persons of European ancestry for both their own grievances and those of their forebears against my people. Therefore, from this day forward, Americans of European ancestry can stand straight and proud, knowing that they are without guilt, and thus obliged not to act like damn fools in their relationship with Americans of African ancestry. That was his pardon to white people.
I mean, I can just hear the howls on Black Twitter as you read that, because honestly, and I want to really, again, pick up on Dr. Bradley's point when he said what went wrong, what stopped working. I think part of what stopped working, and again, I try not to judge past generations by contemporary standards of thinking, right? I'm not making an argument for moral relativism. I'm just saying that people live and make decisions in a particular context. So I understand why Black leaders were, marshaling their resources and political capital to fight against segregation, right? To push back and get Brown versus Board of Ed and Civil Rights Act of '64. And
although we have lots of examples of segregation where Blacks excelled, right?
So and that's what I'm saying. So I understand why they did what they did, but I think one of the things that's carried forward even to this day is the notion, often unspoken, that it is white people and their beliefs, their behaviors, their values that constitute the center of the Black orbit. And when I talked about how people will react to hearing that, that pardon, part of it is because for some Blacks, and particularly Black elites, they can't imagine a world in which white people are able to stand straight up, right? They they make their living on the backs of white folk who remain bent over because of their guilt. I mean, last year we literally saw white people, bending down and kissing the feet, and I mean, of black people for things that they didn't do. So I think part of this is.
And did any of that help a single black child improve their reading outcomes or anything like that?
Of course not. But where you really see it, right? So those examples may sound extreme, but where you really see it is when you listen very closely to the words of, again, Kendi or Jones or Coates, and you listen to them describe schools that are 95, 96% black. So all you know is the demographics. And what they'll say is those schools are segregated. Really? So Abraham Lincoln High School, right? That's 95% black. It's segregated. But Lincoln University, a historically black college and university, is a culturally affirming learning environment. Because what we really don't want to admit is that for many black folk, right? And we've heard this expression before, the white man's ice is colder. So to them, proximity to white people, they don't even talk about resources anymore, right? It's just the school has too many black or Hispanic children, it's segregated, which means it's bad, it's underperforming. And I can tell you from my own experience with my wife and I really want to talk about school choice, because I know that was one of the big issues that Walter Williams tackled when we were looking for schools in the District of Columbia. We went to schools that were majority white, right? That well-resourced. And we compared the outcomes for the black students there to the black students in majority black charter schools that had much higher percentages of at-risk students. And the KIPP school that was closest to our house, those students were doing math. About 73% were at or above grade level in math. And that school was 58% at risk, quote unquote. That percentage was higher than the district average and definitely higher than some of the black kids who went to more, quote unquote, integrated schools. So I think when you start from the position that anything that's all black is all bad, which many of our elites, that is the way that they think. They never say it, but you can hear it closely if you listen closely. When you start from that position, you are always going to end up crafting policy that really has to do with, putting white people in their place, quote unquote, and not with the interests of black folks.
Yeah, can I speak to this directly? Because what's happened, particularly with some progressives, is the infantilization of black agency. They often see a lot of black folk as incapable of having success without white people. Now, I'm wearing a bow tie, I'm chanting a little Malcolm X just for a moment, right? But the idea, I mean, to me, nothing could be more racist than the idea that black folk can't make progress without white people, right? That should be, in most black communities, right, sort of black empowerment, black power anathema.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's what so many progressive policies and the rhetoric seems to sort of suggest. We're not talking about white supremacy. I mean, one aspect of white supremacy is the idea that black folk can't be truly human and thrive unless they are physically in the presence of white people, which should be complete and utter nonsense. Mm-hmm. And just as Brother Squires said, that K-12 school isn't segregated. It might be free, just like Lincoln's free, Howard's free, Hampton's free, right? All those institutions can thrive not because white people are there, but because black people can be and are excellent. And there are not enough institutions calling out, drawing into, tapping into, encouraging black excellence within black communities without needing the presence of white people. And this is so much of what's, I think, undermined the ways in which we thought about policy. And again, not to be beating a I don't want to be too repetitive here, but this is why Dr. Williams was about more liberty, more economic power, less government. Get the state out of the way so Black folk can do what Black folk have always done, which is take care of each other and make sure that other folk thrive. This dependence on white folk for thriving Black communities does nothing but infantilize Black agency and identity and keeps us permanently dependent on the emotionality of white folk. Insofar as they have this sort of benevolent disposition, the only thing many white elite progressives want is to just keep Black folk comfortable in their poverty. They want to keep some Black folk just comfortable, stuck, trapped in so much of these sort of deleterious economic situations and not really working to free people from it. This is why liberty and freedom was so much a part of Dr. Williams' work, because he didn't want people to stay there and be comfortable. He wanted them out.
Right.
Right.
So why do you think Dr. Williams issued this pardon to well-meaning white people? I know, Dr. Wright, you had talked a little bit about this idea of forgiveness.
Yep. Well, I think there's a lot of sort of capital be gained in terms of the emotion of the discourse to not talk about, and I don't want to use the phrase move on, but maybe I would use this phrase transition. How do we begin to make some advancements in terms of how we think about helping each other and having real solidarity? And I think what he's really advocating for is not forgetting the past, because he acknowledges it, but we need to think about the role of forgiveness in liberating us to be creative about solutions. When we are simply trapped and stuck in regurgitating the past and not really creatively thinking about transitioning in the future, we're actually disempowered to think about what's most effective. And insofar as we can introduce mercy and grace and forgiveness as a way to introduce restorative frameworks, I think we'll make some real progress. But I think so much there's too much to give up with some progressives on the left when you wanted to introduce forgiveness, because as Brother Squires said, so many people have made livings off of this. Follow the money, right? They have published books. They've gotten awards. They've been given tenure. They have centers named after their second cousin. They have all sorts of things that have happened because they are profiting off this narrative. Follow the money. There's no money in forgiveness and reconstituting our imaginations about moving forward. There is a lot of money in regurgitating some of those tired narratives that Dr. was talking about. And as you read that, I was also imagining him smoking a cigarette while he was talking about those damn fools, and taking a puff and ending that part of him.
I mean, part of the challenge is that it seems like we're all trapped in these narratives. If you're a Black person, you're supposed to, there it is. Your ticket to power is actually expressing your powerlessness, that you're powerless. And we just got a question from someone who's saying he's white. Is it appropriate for me as a white person to raise these issues with my Black friends and acquaintances, given this larger narrative, right? Because he probably feels like, oh my God, if I say these things, it won't be received in a way that's empowering. And maybe my Black friends are expecting me to express my guilt. What do you think, Dr. Williams, and your own advice would be to this person? Because they've read Red, White, and Black, and that they've seen that there is an alternative viewpoint, but they're not necessarily confident they can actually express it themselves.
So I think it just depends on what type of friends this person has, right? I personally would not want to be friends with any person of any ethnic background that saw me as less than just because of the amount of melanin in my skin. That's not the type of friend that I would want, right? I want people who see me in the same way that they see themselves as a child of God, created in his image, with whose life has inherent dignity and worth. I don't want them to lower standards for me. I don't want them to apologize for things that they didn't do. None of those things strike me as the hallmarks of friendship. But, and I think both you, Ian, and Dr. Bradley said this, and this really goes back to some of, Walter Williams's work. You follow the money, yes, but you follow the money because it's an incentive. And if you incentivize Black victimhood in the name of Black liberation, you are going to get some very, very strange bedfellows, right? I think back to last year when we all saw, the tragic last moments of George Floyd, and I saw how quickly the conversation shifted from, policies around policing to corporate board diversity to, the New York Times bestseller. And at first it was Robin DiAngelo, which again, the height of irony. And then it shifted into Kendi, and then all the diversity, equity, and inclusion, consultants, and then, so on and so on and so forth. And I think that to the extent that the interests of elites, both Black and white, supersede those of the interests of the population in general, we're going to continue to have some of these issues because, again, people are serving their own interests. And we're at a point now in the Black community, and I want to say this because this was not always the case. We're at a point now where our most influential thinkers on race openly state that talking about personal responsibility is in and of itself racist and a function of white supremacy. I cannot think of a more disempowering message to give to people that you say you want to be, quote unquote, liberated. So ultimately what they say is white people have caused all our problems. They've been causing them for 400 years. You can't do anything about it. The best way for us to move forward is to get the people who've been causing our problems to now be the cause of our solutions. And that nothing about that makes sense. Yeah. And I think part of it is that these people, they may have a lot of fancy degrees, but the one thing that they lack is wisdom. And they lack a fundamental understanding of human nature. So when you see these incentives that corporations and elected officials provide for particularly members of the Black elite to continue to claim victimhood so that they can continue to collect checks, that should tell you, why we are where we are in many of our conversations around, race and social outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, Bob Woodson often says the most lethal thing you can do is give someone an excuse for their own failure. And then we see it over and over and over again. Well, I'm actually incredibly, we're coming to the end of our discussion. I want to just give you each about a minute to just share any closing thoughts you have about Dr. Williams, the work of 1776 Unites from the Woodson Center, and how we go forward. All right.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off. This has been a fantastic conversation. I could talk with you guys for hours, days. We need to get together in person and have a massive conference and get everybody in a room and have this discussion. We need to.
I have an idea for this.
We need to have. You may remember a few years ago that State of Black America tour with Tavis Smiley and crew and Cornell West. We need to have our own State of Black America tour. I think for one would be helpful to move forward. I also think to expand Brother Squires' point, we often we've been conflating race and class for too long. Mm-hmm. That's part of the problem. And so many of these things that we think are Black are not Black issues. They're issues of poverty. And so for my white friends who want to talk about these issues, well, go look down the street because there's a white trailer park somewhere that is a poor white community somewhere that has the exact same issues. out of wedlock birth rate, education outcomes terrible, right? Bad health outcomes. All of those sort of racial disparities that we say affect Black folk also affect poor white folk. And one of the things I've introduced to people to do is to study the history of white poverty and really do what was really more normal before Jim Crow started, was having more solidarity between poor people across races, period, to sort of address these issues. Welfare, the expansion of the welfare state just didn't hurt Black folk. It didn't hurt poor Black folk. It hurt poor white folk as well. We need to be building, finally here, an army of new Walter Williams. I've talked about that with you, Ian. We got to do a better job of using the work of the Woodson Center and the 1776 Unites Project to fill in that historical gap, to raise up a generation who want to tell the true story, and to do it with good data so we can get some really good solutions.
Outstanding. And Delano?
Again, Ian, thank you. Dr. Bradley, thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. I want to close in part by talking about something that I think has gone well, right? I think one of the most powerful things about intellectuals is their ability to almost see into the future. And I think Walter Williams was one of those people who was so prescient, right? Particularly, and I'm going to go back to school choice. In the District of Columbia, the city has a common lottery system for both traditional public schools and charter schools. And it's one application, and families can choose up to 12 schools, rank them in their own order. And the application that they use, the online application, has information, the same type of information for every school, both traditional public and public charter. It has a grade rating. It shows you, English and math proficiency. It gives demographics of the school, attendance, suspension, all types of information. And to me, when I first learned about that program, at that time, I want to say maybe between 35 and 40% of DC families were sending their children to charter schools. Now it's almost 50-50. And I think that really speaks to the power and again, getting back to the principles of economics, of what happens when you allow self-motivated people to access full information and make decisions in their best interest. That doesn't mean that every kid who goes to a charter school is going to be the next founder of Facebook. But what it does mean is that parents have the ability to make decisions that work for them, their children, and their families. And I think one of the issues with our current political structure is that both parties are jockeying for position to control our lives. And if I was a political consultant, I would tell conservatives, look, the message is not, hey, I'll be a better dad to you than the Democrats. The message is, a vote for me is a vote for yourself, because I'm going to step back and you're going to choose the school that is best for your children. I'm going to step back and you are going to decide what type of economic opportunities, what type of business you want to start. And I think that is really powerful, because as you both know, I know between us, we've had, probably over 100 years of education, right? When you work in a group project, those projects tend to work best when people have clearly defined roles. But what tends to happen is once one person puts their hand on something, the other person tends to take it off.
Yeah.
And we have existed in a space where the government has put its hands on more and more things in our personal lives, and we have just continued to stand back. And I think people like Walter Williams have given us a roadmap for how to bend that curve back ever so slightly, so that the benefits of liberty and freedom can really be seen both within Black America and the American population at large.
Dr. Bradley, Brother Squires, thank you for an amazing conversation. I have to put in a little plug for my own podcast, The Invisible Men, where I highlight Black excellence, and I'm honored that both of you have joined my colleague Nike Fajors on that show. But what we're talking about is real, and we want these ideas to have a much greater platform. We got a final question from someone asking, why isn't this type of actual Black history taught in schools? Well, this is why the Woodson Center has created the 1776 Unites curriculum and is now launching this new component of that curriculum, which is focusing on incredible contemporary scholars like Dr. Walter Williams. You will soon be seeing the units on Dr. Thomas Sowell, later Dr. Glenn Loury, and we will continue. There is an alternative point of view that is empowering, that is about liberty, that it's about embracing the principles of family, faith, hard work, free enterprise, entrepreneurship. That's how we in the Black community can succeed. And the more that we elevate some of these empowering alternatives, we hope we can make a much greater contribution to how our people progress in the United States. So with that, thank you, everyone. If you are interested in downloading the units that for Dr. Walter Williams, please just go to www.1776unites.com. It's under curriculum. It's all free. There's great work. You can bring it inside your classroom, in your home. This is great content. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we will see you soon. Good night.